Sarah Martinez stood in the courthouse parking lot, clutching the worn manila envelope that contained what felt like the punchline to a cosmic joke. The autumn wind whipped through the small Texas town of Millbrook, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the distant aroma of coffee from the diner across the street. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the surreal weight of what had just transpired inside that imposing brick building where her great-uncle's will had been read aloud to a room full of expectant faces. 147 acres of farmland in Millbrook County, Texas, to my great-niece, Sarah Elena Martinez. The lawyer's voice had been clinical, matter-of-fact, as if he hadn't just handed her a key to a door she never knew existed. Sarah had sat there, flanked by distant relatives she barely recognized, feeling like an intruder at someone else's family reunion. Uncle Joaquín had been a mystery to her, a weathered man who sent Christmas cards with $5 bills tucked inside and spoke in broken English peppered with Spanish when he called on her birthday. She knew he had never married, never had children, and lived alone on some piece of land out in the middle of nowhere. But this felt impossible. The other relatives had shuffled out of the courthouse with disappointed murmurs and sideways glances. Sarah caught fragments of their conversations as they passed. Should have gone to someone who knows farming. Girls got no business with land. Joaquín must have lost his mind in those final years. Their words stung, but they weren't wrong. What did a 34-year-old divorced mother of two know about farming? She could barely keep the houseplants in her cramped apartment alive. If you're enjoying Sarah's incredible journey from struggling single mother to potential oil heiress, this story is just getting started. Tap that like button to show your support, and don't forget to share this amazing tale of believing in impossible dreams. Subscribe for more incredible stories of ordinary people who refuse to give up. As she walked to her dented Honda Civic, a vehicle held together by hope, duct tape, and monthly prayers that it would start, Sarah felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Since Marcus left 18 months ago, unexpected expenses arose with the reliability of sunrise. The drive to Millbrook took 45 minutes through countryside that grew increasingly desolate with each passing mile. Sarah had called her sister Elena from the courthouse steps, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what had happened. "Land, Elena. Uncle Joaquín left me land. Like actual farmland. What am I supposed to do with farmland?" Elena laughed, not unkindly, but with the sort of incredulous joy that comes from witnessing the universe's occasional bout of generosity toward those who desperately need it. "Maybe you can sell it," Elena had suggested, ever practical. "Even if it's not worth much, it might help with the kids' expenses." The idea of selling had immediately taken root in Sarah's mind. Of course she would sell it. What other choice did she have? The last thing she needed was maintaining property she couldn't afford and didn't understand. But first, she had to see it. Something deep in her chest, maybe curiosity, maybe obligation to Uncle Joaquín's memory, compelled her to drive out and witness firsthand what he had deemed worthy of leaving her. The GPS on her phone led her down increasingly narrow roads, past rusted mailboxes and sprawling properties with more cows than people. The landscape was beautiful in its vastness, all rolling hills and endless sky, but it felt foreign to someone who had spent her entire adult life in suburban neighborhoods where the biggest yard belonged to the house on the corner. The farmhouse looked like a cautionary tale about deferred maintenance, weathered gray paint, sagging porch, boarded windows. Sarah parked next to what might have once been a barn, but now resembled a wooden skeleton slowly collapsing in on itself. She sat in her car for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to process the magnitude of what she was looking at. This wasn't just a fixer-upper. This was a complete reconstruction project that would require more money than she made in several years. The land itself stretched in every direction, acre after acre of what appeared to be nothing but scrub brush, rocky soil, and the occasional cluster of struggling mesquite trees. As she finally forced herself to get out of the car, a pickup truck materialized from the direction of the main road, kicking up a cloud of dust that seemed to follow it like a resentful spirit. The truck pulled to a stop near the house, and two men climbed out, both weathered and squinting with the particular brand of skepticism that rural communities reserve for outsiders. "You must be the niece," said the older of the two, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from the same rocky soil that surrounded them. He wore a John Deere cap pulled low over eyes that had clearly seen too much to be impressed by much. "I'm Bill Henderson. This here's my son, Tommy. We farm the land adjacent to this property." The way he said property made it clear that he was being generous with the term. Tommy, a younger version of his father, but with the same expression of barely concealed disdain, nodded in Sarah's direction. "Heard about Joaquín. Real shame. He was a good neighbor, even if he never did much with this place." Sarah introduced herself, acutely aware of how out of place she must look in her office attire, a modest skirt and blouse that were practical for air-conditioned environments, but completely inappropriate for standing in a field under the harsh Texas sun. "I'm just here to see what he left me. I'm planning to sell, actually." Bill and Tommy exchanged a look that Sarah couldn't quite interpret, but it made her stomach clench with foreboding. "Well," Bill said slowly, removing his cap to scratch at graying hair, "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you might want to adjust your expectations on that front." "What do you mean?" Tommy stepped forward, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn jeans. "Ma'am, no offense, but this land ain't worth much. Soil's too rocky for most crops, not enough water for cattle grazing, and the location's too far from anything to be valuable for development. Joaquín tried for years to make something of it, but he gestured helplessly at the deteriorating farmhouse and overgrown fields. Your uncle was a dreamer," Bill added, his tone not entirely unkind. "Always talking about how this land had potential, how he was going to strike it rich somehow. But the reality is, you'd be lucky to get $20,000 for the whole 147 acres, and that's if you could find someone willing to take on the headache." $20,000. Sarah felt her hopes deflate like a punctured balloon. $20,000 wouldn't even cover Sophia's medical bills from her appendectomy earlier that year, let alone provide the financial breathing room she desperately needed. But even as disappointment washed over her, a stubborn part of her bristled at the casual dismissal in these men's voices. "Joaquín used to come into town talking about oil," Tommy continued, and this time both men chuckled, not with malice, but with the patient amusement reserved for harmless delusions. "Every few months he'd show up at the diner claiming he'd seen signs, talking about getting some company to come out and do surveys. Poor old guy watched too many movies, I think." Sarah felt a flush of defensive anger on behalf of a man she barely knew. "Maybe he knew something you don't." The silence that followed was uncomfortable, filled with the sound of wind moving through the mesquite trees and the distant lowing of cattle from a neighboring farm. Bill cleared his throat diplomatically. "Look, miss, I don't mean to sound harsh. Your uncle was a good man, and he clearly thought highly enough of you to leave you this place. But oil exploration costs money, serious money, and the geological surveys done in this area over the years have never shown much promise. Companies don't just drill wells for fun." As if summoned by their conversation, another vehicle appeared on the horizon, this time a gleaming white SUV that looked distinctly out of place on the dusty farm roads. It pulled up beside the other vehicles, and a woman emerged who seemed to have stepped out of a country club magazine. Everything about her was precisely maintained, her blonde hair styled in perfect waves despite the wind, her clothes clearly expensive, but designed to look casually rustic, her smile bright and predatory. "Well, well," she said, approaching the group with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Sarah Martinez, I presume. I'm Janet Holloway. I represent several investors who are very interested in helping you with your situation." The way she said situation made it sound like a disease that needed immediate treatment. Janet's gaze swept over the deteriorating property with the practiced eye of someone evaluating a clearance sale. "I heard about your inheritance, and I have to say, I think we can help each other out. My clients are looking to acquire properties in this area for agricultural development, and we're prepared to make you a very fair offer." Bill and Tommy exchanged another look, this time one of pure skepticism mixed with protective instinct. "Janet," Bill said carefully, "this lady just inherited this place. Maybe give her a chance to figure out what she wants to do before you start circling like a vulture?" Janet's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "Oh, Bill, always so dramatic. I'm simply offering a solution that benefits everyone. Sarah here clearly has no use for farmland. No offense, dear. And my clients have the resources to put this property to productive use." "What kind of offer?" Sarah asked, hating herself for the desperate edge that crept into her voice. "15,000 cash, and we handle all the paperwork. You could have a check in your hands by the end of the week." Janet's smile widened as she watched Sarah's face. "I know it might not sound like much, but given the condition of the property and the challenges of this particular piece of land, I think you'll find it's quite generous." 15,000, even less than what Bill had estimated. Sarah felt something crumble inside her chest, not just disappointment, but a deeper sense of defeat that seemed to encompass not just this moment, but the entire trajectory of her life since the divorce. Here she was, standing on land that her great-uncle had loved enough to spend his life trying to make something of, and the best she could hope for was $15,000, and the knowledge that she'd given up without even trying? "I need to think about it," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Janet's expression flickered with something that might have been annoyance, quickly replaced by understanding patience. "Of course, dear. Take all the time you need, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait forever, and frankly, maintaining a property like this can become quite expensive quite quickly." As if to emphasize her point, a gust of wind chose that moment to tear a piece of loose siding from the farmhouse, sending it clattering across the yard like a wounded bird. Sarah watched it tumble past the rusted remains of what might have once been farm equipment and felt the weight of Uncle Joaquín's dreams settling on her shoulders like an inherited burden she wasn't strong enough to carry. But as the others began to discuss logistics and practicalities around her, Sarah found herself looking past the obvious decay to something else, something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light fell across the rolling hills, turning the scrub brush golden and making the vast skies seem full of possibilities instead of emptiness. Maybe it was the stubborn voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like her great-uncle, speaking in broken English about oil and dreams and the potential that others couldn't see. Or maybe it was simply the realization that for the first time in 18 months, she owned something that was entirely hers, something that Marcus couldn't claim half of, something that couldn't be taken away by missed payments or bad luck or the casual cruelty of circumstance. Standing there, on 147 acres of supposedly worthless land, Sarah Martinez felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. The dangerous, terrifying, intoxicating possibility that everything might be about to change. The drive back to her apartment felt like traveling between two different worlds, from the vast possibility of open sky and endless land to the cramped reality of her second-floor unit in a complex where the air conditioning worked sporadically and the neighbors' arguments bled through paper-thin walls. Sarah sat in her parked car for a long moment, staring up at the building that had been home for the past year and a half, ever since the divorce forced her to downsize from the modest suburban house she and Marcus had shared. The apartment complex wasn't the worst place in town, but it wasn't anywhere she had imagined living at 34. Miguel and Sophia were waiting for her in the living room, homework spread across the coffee table that doubled as their dining table when the kitchen was too cluttered for meals. They looked up as she entered, and Sarah felt the familiar pang of guilt that came with seeing her children in this environment, so different from the home they had known before their father decided that responsibility was a burden he no longer wished to carry. "How did it go, Mama?" Sophia asked, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. At 8, she still possessed the uncomplicated faith that good things could happen to good people, that surprises were usually pleasant, and that adults had everything figured out. Sarah envied her daughter's optimism, even as she worried about protecting it. Miguel, 2 years older and carrying the weight of being the man of the house since Marcus left, studied his mother's face with the analytical intensity of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of adult distress. "You look tired," he observed, which was his way of asking if everything was okay without putting additional pressure on her to pretend it was. Sarah sank into the worn armchair that had been a wedding gift from Marcus's parents, one of the few pieces of furniture she had been allowed to keep. "I inherited something from your great-great-uncle Joaquín," she said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into her voice. "A farm, 147 acres. Sophia's eyes widened with the sort of wonder that Sarah remembered feeling herself, once upon a time, before she learned that surprising news was usually complicated news. "A farm? Like with animals and tractors and everything?" "Well, not exactly everything," Sarah said carefully. "It's more like land, empty land, with an old house that needs a lot of work." Miguel's expression remained skeptical. "Is it worth money?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that wouldn't quite catch. Sarah looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw too much understanding in his 10-year-old eyes. He knew about the stack of bills held down by a coffee mug on the kitchen counter. He knew why she sometimes stared at her phone with that particular expression of dread before opening text messages from the bank. He knew why they ate a lot of rice and beans, and why shopping trips involved careful calculations and the frequent return of items to shelves. "That's complicated," Sarah said finally. "Some people think it might be worth a little money, others think it's not worth much at all." "What do you think?" Sophia asked, and the simple directness of the question cut straight through all the adult equivocation and uncertainty to the heart of the matter. Sarah looked at her daughter, this bright, trusting girl who still believed her mother had all the answers, and felt the crushing weight of not knowing. She said slowly, "I think that Uncle Joaquín must have had a reason for leaving it to me, but I'm not sure what that reason was." That night, after the children were asleep in the bedroom they shared, Miguel on the bottom bunk, Sophia curled up above him with the stuffed elephant that had been her comfort since toddlerhood, Sarah sat at her laptop, researching everything she could find about Millbrook County, Texas, and the possibilities of oil exploration. The internet was a maze of conflicting information, geological surveys that dated back decades, industry reports filled with terminology she didn't understand, and forum discussions where armchair experts debated the likelihood of oil deposits in various regions with the passion of sports fans arguing about draft picks. What she found wasn't encouraging. The area had been surveyed multiple times over the years, with results that ranged from unlikely to not commercially viable. The most recent professional assessment, conducted 15 years earlier, had concluded that while there might be small pockets of oil or natural gas in the region, the cost of extraction would far exceed any potential profit. It was exactly the kind of information that should have convinced her to call Janet Holloway first thing in the morning and accept the $15,000 offer. Instead, she found herself reading about Uncle Joaquín. Sarah had never been close to her great-uncle, but she had known him as a fixture at family gatherings, a weathered man who spoke with conviction about dreams that others dismissed as fantasies. Her grandmother, Joaquín's sister, had always spoken of him with a mixture of affection and exasperation. She used to say, "Joaquín sees gold in every sunset. He's been chasing rainbows his whole life, but at least he never stops believing in them." Her phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. "How did it go today? Kids asleep?" Sarah found herself typing a response that surprised her.
I think Uncle Joaquín might have been onto something. Elena's reply came quickly. Sarah, honey, please tell me you're not thinking of keeping that farm. The conversation that followed was conducted in the shorthand of sisters who knew each other's strengths and weaknesses with uncomfortable clarity. Elena, ever practical, pointed out the obvious problems. Sarah knew nothing about farming, land management, or oil exploration. She was already stretched thin financially and emotionally. The children needed stability, not another disruption in their lives. The smart move, the only sensible move, was to sell quickly and use whatever money she could get to build a small emergency fund. But what if he was right, Sarah typed. What if there really is oil, and I'm just giving it away for $15,000? And what if there isn't? Elena responded. What if you spend money you don't have chasing a dream that doesn't exist? What happens to Miguel and Sophia then? It was a fair question, and one that kept Sarah awake long after she closed the laptop and lay staring at the ceiling of her bedroom. Through the thin walls, she could hear the muffled sounds of her neighbors' lives. A television turned up too loud, a baby crying, the low murmur of an argument that had been ongoing for months. This building, this life, this constant struggle to make ends meet, was this what she wanted for her children? Was this the legacy she was building for them? The next morning brought no clarity, only the familiar routine of getting two children ready for school while juggling her own preparation for another day at the office. Miguel moved through his morning rituals with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned not to create additional stress for adults who were already overwhelmed. Sophia chattered about a school project involving family history, asking questions about Uncle Joaquín that Sarah couldn't answer. "Did he have a family?" asked Sophia while Sarah braided her hair at the kitchen counter. "No, baby. He lived alone." "Was he lonely?" Sarah paused, realizing she had never considered this question. Had Uncle Joaquín been lonely, or had he found companionship in his dreams? Comfort in his certainty that something valuable lay beneath the surface of his seemingly barren land? "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "Maybe sometimes, but I think he had things he loved. His land, his dreams about what it could become." "Maybe that's why he left it to you," Sophia said, with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possess. "Maybe he knew you needed dreams too."
The observation hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. When was the last time she had allowed herself to dream about anything beyond making it through another month without crisis? When had she stopped believing that her life could be something more than a series of problems to be managed? At work, Sarah found herself distracted, mechanically processing paperwork while her mind wandered to 147 acres of Texas land. During her lunch break, she called a local real estate agent to get a professional assessment of the property's value. The conversation was brief and discouraging. "Millbrook County? That's pretty remote. Without seeing it, I'd estimate somewhere between 12 and 20,000, depending on access roads and water rights. Agricultural land in that area just isn't in high demand." $20,000, the same figure Bill Henderson had mentioned. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't life-changing either. It would cover Sophia's medical bills and maybe provide a small cushion for emergencies, but it wouldn't fundamentally alter their circumstances. They would still be living paycheck to paycheck, still worried about every unexpected expense, still trapped in the cycle of making just enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. That afternoon, Janet Holloway called. Her voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who made a living convincing people to make decisions that benefited her more than them. "Sarah, dear, I hope you've had time to think about our conversation yesterday. I wanted to touch base and see if you had any questions about our offer." "I'm still considering my options," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Of course, I completely understand. It's a big decision. But I did want to mention that my clients are quite motivated to move forward quickly. Properties like yours tend to deteriorate rapidly without proper maintenance, and winter weather can be particularly hard on structures that are already compromised." There it was, the gentle pressure disguised as helpful concern. Sarah had encountered enough salespeople in her insurance work to recognize the technique. Create urgency, emphasize problems, position yourself as the solution to difficulties you've helped identify. How quickly would they want to close? "Oh, we could have everything wrapped up within a week. Cash transaction, no inspection contingencies, minimal paperwork. You could put this whole situation behind you and focus on your family." Put this whole situation behind you, as if Uncle Joaquín's legacy was an inconvenience to be discarded rather than a possibility to be explored. Sarah felt a flare of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "I'll let you know," she said, and ended the call before Janet could respond. That evening, Sarah sat in her car outside the children's school, waiting for them to emerge from after-school care. She watched other parents, some rushing from office jobs like herself, others arriving in expensive SUVs with the unhurried confidence of people whose biggest worry was whether to serve quinoa or brown rice for dinner. She wondered about their stories, their struggles, their dreams. Did any of them lie awake at night wondering if they were making the right choices? Did any of them feel the weight of responsibility pressing down like a physical force? Miguel and Sofia climbed into the car with the easy chatter of children whose day had been filled with the ordinary dramas of friendship and learning. They talked about a science project, a disagreement at recess, a funny story their teacher had told. Their lives were rich with experiences and relationships that had nothing to do with money or security, and Sarah felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest. "Mama," Miguel said as they pulled into the apartment complex parking lot, "Tommy Henderson called."
Sarah's heart skipped. "Tommy Henderson? How do you know that name?" "He left a message on the machine. Said he wanted to talk to you about the farm." Inside the apartment, Sarah played the voicemail with growing confusion. Tommy's voice was hesitant, different from the confident dismissal he had displayed at the farm. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Tommy Henderson. I wanted to talk to you about something. About your uncle's land. Could you call me back? It's important." The phone rang 3 times before Tommy answered. "Mrs. Martinez? Thanks for calling back. Listen, I've been thinking about what my dad and I said yesterday and, well, there's something you should know." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "What kind of something?" "It's about your uncle, about the things he used to say about oil. See, everyone in town thought he was just, well, wishful thinking. But there's something nobody talks about." "What do you mean?" Tommy's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "About 5 years ago, there was a company that came through here, quiet-like. They did some kind of testing, but they didn't publicize it. Joaquín knew about it, though. He used to mention it to my dad. Said they found something, but that the company wasn't ready to move forward yet." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of company?" "Petroleum exploration, small outfit, but legitimate. They tested several properties in the area, including some land adjacent to your uncle's farm. The thing is, Mrs. Martinez, I think your uncle might have been onto something, and I think Janet Holloway knows it too." The line went quiet, except for the sound of Sarah's heartbeat in her ears. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your uncle was a good man, and because I don't like seeing people get taken advantage of. Janet's been buying up land in this area for the past 2 years, always offering just enough to convince people to sell quickly. She's not working for agricultural development like she claims." Sarah sank into her armchair, mind racing. "What should I do?" "I don't know," Tommy said honestly, "but I'd sure think twice before selling to Janet Holloway. And if I were you, I'd try to find out more about that exploration company. Your uncle kept records of everything. If you decide to go through his papers, you might find something interesting." After the call ended, Sarah sat in the gathering dusk of her living room, listening to her children's voices from their bedroom as they worked on homework. Everything she thought she understood about her situation had shifted, like looking at a photograph and suddenly realizing it was upside down. Uncle Joaquín might have been right. Janet Holloway might be lying, And Sarah Martinez, divorced mother of two, insurance claims processor, woman who could barely afford her car payment, might be sitting on something valuable enough that others were actively scheming to take it from her. The smart thing, the safe thing, would still be to sell. Even if there was oil, even if her uncle had been vindicated in his dreams, Sarah had no resources to pursue exploration. She had no knowledge of the industry, no connections, no financial cushion that would allow her to invest in something as uncertain as petroleum exploration. But as she sat there in the darkness, listening to Miguel help Sophia with her math homework, Sarah felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced in months. The dangerous, intoxicating possibility that maybe, just maybe, Uncle Joaquín had left her more than worthless land. Maybe he had left her a chance. The question was whether she was brave enough to take it.
The farmhouse key felt heavier than it should have as Sarah stood on the sagging front porch 3 days later, Miguel and Sophia flanking her like small soldiers preparing for battle. She had made the decision Thursday night after another sleepless session of researching oil exploration companies online, following digital breadcrumbs that led nowhere and everywhere at once. Tommy Henderson's revelation about the mysterious petroleum company had burrowed into her mind like a persistent melody, growing louder with each passing hour until she could no longer ignore it. "It smells funny," Sophia announced, as Sarah wrestled with the old lock, her small nose wrinkling in distaste. The smell was a mixture of dust, old wood, and something else, the particular mustiness that comes from a house that has been closed up too long, where memories settle like sediment in still water. Miguel peered through a gap in the boarded windows, ever the pragmatist. "There's a lot of stuff in there, Mom, like a lot of stuff." The door finally surrendered to Sarah's efforts with a groan that seemed to echo from the bones of the house itself. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the doorway, illuminating a scene that took Sarah's breath away, not with beauty, but with the overwhelming magnitude of one man's lifelong obsession. Uncle Joaquín had been a collector, a hoarder of hope. Every surface in the front room was covered with geological surveys, hand-drawn maps, correspondence with various exploration companies, and newspaper clippings about oil discoveries across Texas. The walls were papered with topographical maps marked in different colored inks, creating a rainbow of possibility and disappointment that stretched from floor to ceiling. Boxes labeled with dates going back 30 years lined the baseboards, each one presumably containing another chapter in Joaquín's quest to prove that his land held secrets worth discovering. "Whoa," Miguel breathed, his usual reserve cracking in the face of such singular dedication. "Uncle Joaquín really believed in this oil thing, didn't he?" Sarah nodded, feeling a mixture of admiration and heartbreak wash over her. This wasn't the casual hobby of a bored retiree. This was the life's work of a man who had staked everything on a dream that others dismissed as delusion. She could see decades of careful documentation, meticulous record-keeping, and stubborn hope laid out before her like an archaeological dig into the mind of a true believer. Sophia had discovered a stack of photographs on a side table and was examining them with the intensity of a detective. "Mama, look at these. There's Uncle Joaquín with some men in hard hats." Sarah took the photographs, studying the images of her great-uncle standing beside various pieces of drilling equipment, always wearing the same expression of hopeful determination. Some photos were clearly from decades ago, judging by the clothing and equipment, but others looked more recent. In several pictures, Joaquín stood next to men in matching polo shirts with a company logo she couldn't quite make out. "These might be from that exploration company Tommy mentioned," Sarah murmured, squinting at the logos. One photo was dated just 3 years ago, showing Uncle Joaquín shaking hands with a younger man in front of what appeared to be some kind of mobile testing unit. They searched through Uncle Joaquín's papers and found a folder labeled Apex Geological Services 2022. The folder contained correspondence with a company she had never heard of, but their letterhead looked professional and their language was technical rather than promotional. Unlike the fly-by-night operations that had taken advantage of Uncle Joaquín's hopes over the years, Apex seemed legitimate. Their initial letter was cautious but intrigued by geological formations on Joaquín's property that were consistent with hydrocarbon-bearing fields 60 miles southwest. "What's a hydrocarbon?" Miguel asked, reading over her shoulder with the fearless curiosity of someone too young to understand the implications of what they were discovering. "It's basically oil and gas," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was reading a technical report that she only partially understood, but certain phrases jumped out at her. Anomalous subsurface readings, potential for significant reserves, and most importantly, recommend comprehensive geological survey pending landowner approval and funding.
The report was dated 6 months before Uncle Joaquín's death. He had been closer than anyone realized to potentially proving his lifelong belief. We're halfway through this incredible story, and Sarah's about to make a decision that will change everything. If you're as invested in her journey as I am, smash that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear about the power of believing in hidden possibilities. Your engagement helps these amazing stories reach more people. Sarah felt a surge of emotion that she couldn't quite name. Part grief for her great-uncle's vindication coming too late, part excitement at the possibility that his dreams might yet be realized, and part terror at the magnitude of what she might be holding in her hands. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. "How's the treasure hunt going? Find any pirate gold yet?" Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Maybe something better." The response came immediately. "Sarah, please tell me you're not getting swept up in Uncle Joaquín's fantasies." But even as she read her sister's concern, Sarah was discovering more evidence that Uncle Joaquín's fantasies might have been grounded in reality. A manila envelope marked "Confidential, Apex Final Assessment" contained geological cross-sections of the property that looked like abstract art, but were annotated with technical notes that spoke of significant potential and recommend immediate follow-up. The final document in the folder stopped Sarah cold. It was a letter from Apex Geological Services, dated just 2 months before Uncle Joaquín's death, outlining a proposal for comprehensive subsurface mapping that would definitively determine the presence and extent of petroleum deposits on the property. The cost was substantial, $50,000, but the letter concluded with a statement that made Sarah's hands shake. "Based on our preliminary findings, we are confident that this investment would yield commercially significant results." $50,000. It might as well have been $50 million for all the accessibility it had to Sarah's current financial situation. But the letter proved that Uncle Joaquín hadn't been chasing windmills. He had been working with legitimate professionals who believed his land held genuine potential. "Mama, someone's coming," Sophia announced from her position near the window. Sarah looked up to see a cloud of dust approaching along the gravel road, resolving into Janet Holloway's white SUV. The timing felt too coincidental to be accidental, and Sarah felt a spike of unease as she quickly gathered the Apex documents and stuffed them into her purse. Janet emerged from her vehicle with the same predatory smile she had worn 3 days earlier, but there was something different in her approach, a subtle urgency that hadn't been there before. She was followed by 2 men Sarah didn't recognize, both wearing expensive suits that looked out of place in the rural setting. "Miss Sarah, darling, what a pleasant surprise," Janet called out, her voice carrying the forced cheer of someone delivering bad news with a smile. "I hope you don't mind, but I brought along some associates who are very interested in your property." The taller of the 2 men stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Miss Martinez, I'm Robert Caldwell, senior partner at Caldwell Development Group. We're prepared to make you an offer that far exceeds anything you're likely to see from other buyers." "How did you know I was here?" Sarah asked, instinctively moving closer to her children. Janet's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Oh, small towns, you know how word travels. The important thing is that we're here now, and we have a proposal that I think will solve all your problems."
The second man opened a briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with legal documents. "We're prepared to offer $35,000 cash with closing in 5 days. No inspections, no contingencies, no complications." $35,000. More than double Janet's original offer, presented with the kind of urgency that suggested they wanted this transaction completed before Sarah could think too carefully about why they were suddenly so motivated.
"That's very generous," Sarah said carefully. "But I haven't decided whether I want to sell yet." Robert Caldwell's expression hardened slightly. "Miss Martinez, I hope you understand that opportunities like this don't last forever. The real estate market in this area is quite volatile, and property values can change rapidly based on various factors." There was something in his tone that felt less like business negotiation and more like veiled threat. Sarah found herself thinking about Tommy Henderson's warning about Janet Holloway's pattern of buying up land in the area, always with pressure to close quickly. "What kind of factors?" Sarah asked. Janet stepped forward smoothly, her smile never wavering. "Oh, the usual things. Economic conditions, zoning changes, environmental concerns. Rural properties can be subject to all sorts of regulations that urban buyers don't typically consider." "Environmental concerns?" Sarah pressed. "What kind of environmental concerns?" The two men exchanged a quick glance that Sarah caught, despite their attempt at subtlety. Robert cleared his throat diplomatically. "Well, there's always the possibility of soil contamination, groundwater issues, that sort of thing. Properties that have been undeveloped for long periods sometimes present unexpected challenges." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Were they threatening to create environmental problems if she didn't sell? Or were they warning her about issues that already existed? Either way, the message was clear. Sell now, or face complications that would make the property worthless. "I need to think about it," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Of course," Janet said, but her tone had lost its warmth. "But please don't think too long. As Robert mentioned, circumstances can change quickly in situations like this." After they left, Sarah sat on the farmhouse steps with her children, watching the dust settle on the gravel road. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward evening, painting the scrubland in shades of gold and amber that made even the barren landscape look beautiful. "They seemed mean," Sophia observed with the uncomplicated honesty of childhood. Miguel nodded gravely. "Why did they want you to sell so fast?" "Usually when people want you to hurry up, it's because they know something you don't." Out of the mouths of babes. Sarah pulled both children close, feeling the weight of the Apex documents in her purse, like a secret that could change everything. "What do you two think I should do?" Sophia considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. Uncle Joaquín spent his whole life believing in this place. Maybe you should believe in it too. "But what if we lose money?" Miguel asked, ever practical. "What if there's no oil and we could have had $35,000? "What if there is oil and we could have had millions?" Sophia countered. Sarah smiled despite the complexity of her situation. Her 8-year-old daughter had just articulated the fundamental question that would determine not just their financial future, but the kind of people they would become. Those who played it safe and accepted what others offered them, or those who dared to believe in possibilities that others couldn't see. That evening, back at their apartment, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. She called Apex Geological Services. The phone rang 4 times before a professional-sounding woman answered. "Apex Geological, this is Christine." "Hi, I'm calling about some work you did for Joaquín Martinez in Millbrook County. I'm his great-niece, and I inherited his property."
There was a pause, then a shift in the woman's tone to something warmer, more interested. "Oh my goodness, you're Joaquín's niece. We were so sorry to hear about his passing. He was quite a character, very passionate about his land. I found your correspondence in his papers, the report about potential petroleum deposits."
Yes, that was quite an interesting project. Joaquín's property showed some very promising geological indicators. Are you considering moving forward with the comprehensive survey? Sarah took a deep breath. What would that involve, exactly? Christine explained the process in terms that Sarah could understand. Seismic testing, core sampling, detailed geological mapping that would provide a definitive answer about the presence and extent of any oil or gas deposits. The cost was indeed $50,000, but Christine mentioned something that Uncle Joaquín's correspondence hadn't included. Given the promising nature of our preliminary findings, we might be able to structure a deal where the survey costs are offset against future royalties if significant deposits are found. It's not something we do often, but your uncle's property was unique. Unique how? Without getting too technical, the geological formations we found are consistent with some of the most productive oil fields in Texas. If we're right about what's down there, we're talking about potentially significant reserves. Sarah's heart was pounding. How significant? Well, I can't make promises, but based on our preliminary data and comparisons with similar formations in the region, if there's oil there, it could be worth tens of millions of dollars. After the call ended, Sarah sat in her darkened living room, listening to the sounds of her children getting ready for bed. Tens of millions of dollars. The phrase seemed to hover in the air like something from a dream, too large and impossible to fit into the reality of her modest apartment and carefully managed budget. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed Elena's number, and Sarah answered with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Okay, what's this about finding something better than pirate gold? Elena asked without preamble. Sarah told her everything, the Apex documents, the geological report, the conversation with Christine, and the increasingly aggressive behavior of Janet Holloway and her associates. Elena listened in silence, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or concern. Sarah, this sounds incredible, but it also sounds incredibly risky. You're talking about believing a company that wants $50,000 to maybe find oil that might exist. But Uncle Joaquín spent his whole life chasing this dream and died with nothing to show for it except a rundown farm and a pile of geological reports. The word stung, but Sarah knew her sister was trying to protect her. Elena continued more gently. I'm not saying there's no oil. I'm saying that even if there is, you don't have $50,000 to find out. And even if you could somehow get the money, there's no guarantee that any oil they find would be enough to justify the investment. But what if it is? What if Uncle Joaquín was right all along? And what if he wasn't? What if you spend money you don't have and end up worse off than you are now? What happens to Miguel and Sofia then? It was the same question Elena had asked before, but now it carried more weight. Sarah wasn't just risking her own financial stability. She was gambling with her children's future. The responsible thing, the safe thing, was to accept the $35,000 from Caldwell Development Group and walk away.
But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the apartment complex settling around her, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Uncle Joaquín's letter from Apex, confident that this investment would yield commercially significant results. She thought about Janet Holloway's sudden urgency, the suspicious timing of the increased offer, and the vague threats about environmental problems. Most of all, she thought about Sofia's words. Maybe you should believe in it too. The next morning brought a crisis that forced Sarah's hand in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her supervisor at the insurance office, a well-meaning woman named Janet Walsh, called Sarah into her office with an expression of uncomfortable sympathy. Sarah, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we're going to have to cut your hours. Budget constraints from the corporate office. Starting Monday, you'll be part-time, 24 hours a week instead of 40. Sarah felt the floor drop out from under her. 24 hours a week wouldn't even cover rent, let alone food, utilities, and all the other expenses that came with raising 2 children alone. For how long? I wish I could give you a timeline, but honestly, I don't know. It could be temporary or... Janet Walsh's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. The company was downsizing and Sarah's position might disappear entirely. Is there anything else available? Maybe in another department? I'll keep my ears open, but right now the whole industry is tightening belts. I'm really sorry, Sarah. I know this is terrible timing. Terrible timing was an understatement. Sarah walked out of the office in a daze, her mind racing through calculations that didn't add up no matter how she arranged them. Part-time work wouldn't support them. She would have to find another job, probably 2 jobs, just to maintain their current standard of living, which was already precarious enough. Unless... The thought hit her like lightning, dangerous and illuminating. $35,000 from Caldwell Development Group would give her breathing room, time to find new employment without the immediate pressure of rent and bills. It was the safe choice, the responsible choice. But it was also giving up, potentially forever, on the possibility that Uncle Joaquín had been right. Sarah sat in her car in the insurance office parking lot, phone in hand, Janet Holloway's business card on her lap. All she had to do was make one call, and her immediate financial problems would be solved. The smart money was on taking the sure thing. Instead, she found herself dialing a different number. Apex Geological, this is Christine. Christine, this is Sarah Martinez. We spoke yesterday about my uncle's property. I want to move forward with the comprehensive geological survey. There was a pause. That's wonderful news, Sarah, but I should mention that we'll need payment up front before we can begin the work. I understand, but you mentioned something about structuring a deal based on future royalties? Yes, that's possible in certain circumstances. Given the promising nature of the preliminary data, we might be able to work out an arrangement where we conduct the survey in exchange for a percentage of any future oil revenues. It's not our standard practice, but your uncle's property is, well, it's special. Sarah took a deep breath. What kind of percentage are we talking about?
Typically, in arrangements like this, we would take a 40% stake in any oil discovered. You would retain 60% ownership, but we would handle all extraction costs and operations. 60% of something was infinitely better than 100% of nothing, and if Christine was right about the potential value of any oil discovery, even 60% could be life-changing money. I'd like to move forward, Sarah said, surprised by the confidence in her own voice. Excellent. I'll have our legal team draw up the partnership agreement. We can have a crew out there by the end of next week. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her car, heart pounding with the magnitude of what she had just committed to. She had essentially bet her children's future on Uncle Joaquín's dream, trusting the judgment of a man she barely knew and a company she had spoken to for a total of 20 minutes. But as she thought about the alternative, accepting Janet Holloway's offer and spending the rest of her life wondering, what if, Sarah felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced in months, hope mixed with determination, dangerous and intoxicating as any drug. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Heard you're planning some drilling on your property. Might want to reconsider. Some projects can be more trouble than they're worth. Sarah stared at the message, feeling a chill run down her spine. Someone was watching her, monitoring her decisions, and felt confident enough to send veiled threats to her personal phone? Instead of fear, she felt anger rise in her chest, hot, clean, and clarifying. She typed back, "Thanks for the concern, but I think I'll take my chances." The response came immediately. "Some chances aren't worth taking. Think about your children." Sarah's hands shook as she read the words. They knew about Miguel and Sofia. They were willing to use her children as leverage to force her compliance. The smart thing would be to back down, to call Apex and cancel the survey and take the safe money and protect her family from whatever these people were capable of. Instead, Sarah Martinez, divorced mother of 2, part-time insurance processor, owner of 147 acres of supposedly worthless Texas farmland, made a decision that would define not just her future, but the kind of person she was willing to become. She deleted the threatening messages, turned off her phone, and drove to the elementary school to pick up her children. Tonight, she would tell Miguel and Sofia that they were about to embark on an adventure that Uncle Joaquín had spent his entire life preparing for. Tomorrow, she would face whatever consequences came from choosing hope over fear, possibility over safety. But first, she would stop by the farmhouse one more time, to stand on the land that had driven one man to spend his life believing in something others couldn't see. Maybe, Sarah thought, as she watched the Texas landscape roll past her car windows, it was time to see what all that belief had been worth. The Apex Geological Services convoy arrived on a Tuesday morning that dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made even the scrubland look promising. Sarah stood on the farmhouse porch with Miguel and Sofia, watching 3 trucks and a massive drilling rig navigate the narrow gravel road like a mechanical parade. The children had insisted on coming to witness what Sofia had dubbed the treasure hunt, and Sarah hadn't had the heart to leave them with Elena when this moment felt too significant for anything but family. Christine Matthews emerged from the lead truck, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of confident stride that came from decades of working in male-dominated environments. She wore steel-toed boots and carried herself with the authority of someone who had spent her career proving she belonged wherever oil might be found.
Sarah Martinez, I presume. Christine extended a firm handshake, her eyes already scanning the landscape with the practiced assessment of a professional treasure hunter. Beautiful piece of land you've got here. Your Uncle Joe's well. Chose well for what? Miguel asked with the directness that 10-year-olds brought to adult conversations. Christine smiled, crouching down to Miguel's eye level. For finding oil, young man. See, oil doesn't just exist anywhere. It needs very specific geological conditions. The right kind of rock formations, the right pressure, the right age. This land has all the markers we look for. Sarah felt her heart skip as Christine's words confirmed what she had been hoping since discovering Uncle Joaquín's papers. How long will the testing take? Seismic survey will take about 3 days. We'll map the subsurface formations, identify the most promising drilling locations. If the data confirms what our preliminary assessment suggested, we'll start core sampling immediately. Christine's expression grew more serious. Sarah, I want to be clear about something. Based on what we found in our initial survey, I'm more optimistic about this site than I've been about any property in 15 years. But I don't want to raise false hopes. The oil business is full of promising starts and disappointing endings. Over the next 3 days, Sarah found herself dividing her time between her reduced work schedule at the insurance office and the farmhouse, where the Apex team methodically conducted their survey. The process was less dramatic than she had expected, mostly men in hard hats placing sensors around the property and conducting what looked like careful scientific measurements rather than the dramatic drilling she had anticipated. Sofia was fascinated by the seismic equipment, following the technicians around with questions that they answered with surprising patience. Miguel appointed himself the unofficial supervisor, creating detailed drawings of the equipment and keeping a log of daily activities with the thoroughness he brought to all his projects. On Thursday afternoon, Christine approached Sarah with an expression that was carefully neutral but couldn't quite hide an underlying excitement. We've completed the seismic mapping. Would you like to see the results? They gathered around a laptop in the farmhouse living room, the same space where Uncle Joaquín had spent decades studying maps and geological reports. Christine pulled up a 3-dimensional image that looked like abstract art, but represented the geological layers beneath Sarah's land. "This is remarkable," she said, pointing to various colored formations on the screen. "See this formation here, about 800 feet down, and this one at 1,200 feet? We're looking at what appears to be 2 separate oil-bearing strata, both of significant size." Sarah stared at the colorful layers on the screen, trying to understand what she was looking at. What does significant size mean? Christine looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing how much hope to allow into her voice. "Sarah, I want to be clear about something. Based on what we found in our initial survey,
I'm more optimistic about this site than I've been about any property in 15 years. But I don't want to raise false hopes. The oil business is full of promising starts and disappointing endings. Sarah found herself dividing her time between her reduced work schedule at the insurance office and the farmhouse, where the Apex team methodically conducted their survey. It seemed less dramatic than she had expected, mostly men in hard hats placing sensors around the property and conducting what looked like careful scientific measurements rather than the dramatic drilling she had anticipated. Sophia was fascinated by the seismic equipment, following the technicians around with questions that they answered with surprising patience. Miguel appointed himself the unofficial supervisor, creating detailed drawings of the equipment and keeping a log of daily activities with the thoroughness he brought to all his projects. Her phone rang, startling her from calculations that refused to feel real. The caller ID showed Elena's number. "Okay, I've been patient for 3 days, but I can't take it anymore," Elena said without preamble. "What's happening with the drilling? Are they finding anything?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Elena, I think Uncle Joaquín was right. I think there's oil. A lot of oil." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "How much oil?" "Christine thinks maybe 15 to 20 million barrels. Maybe more." Another long silence. Then, "Sarah, do you understand what you're saying?" "I'm saying that Uncle Joaquín spent 50 years believing in something that everyone else thought was crazy, and he might have been right all along." "I'm saying," Elena's voice was rising with excitement and disbelief, "that you might be rich. Like really rich, like never worry about money again rich." The conversation continued for another hour, with Elena alternating between celebration and caution, reminding Sarah that nothing was certain until actual oil was extracted from the ground. But even Elena's natural pessimism couldn't entirely dampen the growing sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. Friday morning brought the core drilling phase, a process that involved sinking narrow test holes into the formations Christine had identified. Sarah had arranged to take the day off work, possibly, she realized, with a mixture of terror and excitement, one of the last days she would ever need to worry about her hourly wage at the insurance office. The drilling process was louder and more dramatic than the seismic testing, with the rig creating a rhythmic pounding that echoed across the empty landscape. Christine explained that they were extracting core samples from specific depths, looking for actual oil-saturated rock that would confirm the presence of extractable petroleum. "How will you know if you find oil?" Sophia asked, watching the drilling operation with wide eyes. "Oh, we'll know," Christine said with a smile. "Oil has a very distinctive smell, and when we pull up cores from an oil-bearing formation, you can see it, smell it, even taste it if you're brave enough." By noon, they had extracted cores from the first formation at 800 feet. Christine and her team huddled around the samples like archaeologists, examining ancient artifacts, occasionally calling out technical terms that meant nothing to Sarah but seemed to increase the general level of excitement among the professionals. "Sarah, come here. You need to see this," Christine called, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Sarah approached the core samples, which looked like cylinders of rock and mud, but even to her untrained eye, there was something different about them. They glistened with a dark substance that caught the afternoon light, and the air around them carried a sharp, distinctive odor. "Is that—" she began. "Oil," Christine confirmed, her professional composure finally cracking into a broad grin. "Good quality crude oil and a lot of it. These cores are saturated." Miguel and Sophia crowded around, staring at the dark-stained rock samples that represented the vindication of their great-great-uncle's lifelong dreams. "It's really oil?" Miguel asked, his voice filled with wonder. "It's really oil," Christine confirmed. "And if this formation is as extensive as our seismic data suggests, we're looking at a discovery that will make headlines." A convoy of black SUVs interrupted the celebration. Janet Holloway emerged with Robert Caldwell and several associates, their expensive suits and angry expressions making their intentions clear. "Sarah," Janet called out, her previous veneer of friendly concern completely abandoned, "I think we need to have a conversation."
Christine stepped forward, positioning herself between the newcomers and the drilling equipment. "I'm sorry, but this is a private operation on private property. You'll need to leave." Robert Caldwell ignored Christine entirely, focusing his attention on Sarah with the intensity of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Miss Martinez, you've made some very poor decisions over the past week, decisions that have caused my clients considerable inconvenience." "Your clients?" Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The people I represent have substantial investments in this region. Your exploration activities are creating complications for those investments." One of the men Sarah didn't recognize stepped forward, pulling out a tablet and showing her what appeared to be legal documents. "We're prepared to offer you $200,000 for the property right now, cash, no questions asked. You sign the papers, take the money, and walk away from all this." $200,000? 6 times Janet's original offer, presented with the kind of urgency that confirmed everything Sarah had suspected about the true value of her inheritance. "And if I don't?" Sarah asked. The man's smile was cold and professional. "Then you might find that oil exploration can be a very complicated business. Environmental regulations, zoning issues, permit problems. Sometimes projects that look promising can get tied up in legal complications for years." Christine had heard enough. "I'm calling the police," she announced, pulling out her phone. "That won't be necessary," Robert said smoothly. "We're not here to cause trouble. We're here to make a reasonable business proposition to Miss Martinez." "Reasonable?" Sarah felt anger rising in her chest, hot and clean and clarifying. "You've been sending me threatening text messages, intimidating my children, and now you're trying to steal property that might be worth millions of dollars for $200,000? "Millions," one of the security men laughed. "Lady, you've been reading too many fairy tales. This is a patch of worthless scrubland in the middle of nowhere." Christine's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. "Actually, based on our core samples and seismic data, this property is sitting on top of what appears to be one of the largest oil reserves discovered in Texas in the past decade." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah watched the expressions on the faces of Janet's associates shift from confident dismissal to shock to something that looked like panic. Robert Caldwell recovered first, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You're bluffing. There's no oil here. We've had this area surveyed." "When and by whom? That's proprietary information. I'll bet it is, because I'm guessing your surveys showed exactly what ours did, that this land is sitting on top of a geological gold mine, and I'm guessing that's why you've been so desperate to buy it for pennies on the dollar." Sarah felt pieces clicking into place in her mind like tumblers in a lock. "You've known all along, haven't you? You've known there was oil here, and you've been trying to steal it." Janet's composure finally cracked. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Sarah. This is bigger than you understand. There are people with serious money invested in acquiring properties in this region, and they don't appreciate interference from amateurs who don't understand the business. What I understand is that my great-uncle spent his entire life believing in something that everyone said was impossible, and what I understand is that he was right." She gestured toward the oil-stained core samples. "Uncle Joaquín died believing there was oil on this land, and there is. He died believing this property was valuable, and it is. He died believing that someday someone would prove he wasn't crazy." Sarah looked at Janet Holloway, at Robert Caldwell, at all the expensive suits and threatening faces that had tried to intimidate her into giving up something she was only now beginning to understand. Well, guess what? Today is that day. Christine's phone buzzed, and she answered it with professional efficiency. "Yes? What? Are you certain?" "You know,
Christine said, ending her call and approaching Sarah with something like awe in her expression. In 30 years of geological work, I've never seen formations quite like this. Your uncle didn't just find oil. He found what might be one of the most significant privately owned reserves in the country. Sarah looked at the ramshackle farmhouse where Uncle Joaquín had spent decades mapping dreams onto geological surveys, at the scrubland that had hidden its secrets for millions of years, at the drilling equipment that had finally proven what one stubborn old man had never stopped believing. "How much?" she asked quietly. "All of it together. How much is it worth?" Christine was quiet for a long moment, running calculations in her head with the expertise of someone who had spent her career putting price tags on possibility. Conservative estimate, accounting for extraction costs, market fluctuations, and a 30-year extraction timeline, $85 million. $85 million. Sarah Martinez, divorced mother of two, part-time insurance processor, owner of 147 acres of supposedly worthless Texas farmland, felt the number settle into her consciousness like a truth too large to comprehend all at once. Uncle Joaquín had been right about everything, about the oil, about the value of the land, about the importance of believing in something even when everyone else thought you were crazy. He had spent his entire life knowing something that the world had refused to see, and he had died before he could prove it. But he had left Sarah the chance to prove it for him. As the Texas sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah stood on the land that had made her rich beyond imagining, holding her children close, and felt Uncle Joaquín's presence like a benediction on the evening wind. Somewhere, she thought, he was smiling. 6 months after the oil discovery, Sarah stood on the newly constructed observation deck that overlooked what had become the Joaquín Martinez Memorial Oil Field, watching the sunrise paint the industrial landscape in shades of gold and amber. The transformation of Uncle Joaquín's land had been swift and dramatic. What had been empty scrubland was now a carefully orchestrated symphony of extraction equipment, processing facilities, and the constant, profitable hum of petroleum being drawn from deep beneath the Texas earth. The numbers had exceeded even Christine's optimistic projections. 3 separate oil-bearing formations had been identified and developed, producing a combined flow rate that made the Martinez property one of the most productive private oil operations in the state. The deeper formations that Christine's team had discovered contained an additional 40 million barrels of crude, bringing the total reserves to over 75 million barrels of high-quality petroleum. Sarah's transformation had been no less dramatic than her land's. The woman who had stood in the same spot 8 months earlier, clutching a worn manila envelope and wondering how she would pay next month's rent, now oversaw an operation that generated more money in a week than she had previously made in a year. The financial advisors, lawyers, and oil industry executives who now comprised her regular circle of consultants still sometimes looked surprised when they remembered they were taking instructions from a former part-time insurance processor. "The morning reports are ready for your review," said David Chen, the operations manager Christine had recommended to oversee the day-to-day production. David was a soft-spoken engineer in his 40s who had spent his career managing oil operations for major corporations before Sarah had convinced him to join what she jokingly called the family business. Sarah accepted the tablet with the easy confidence she had developed over months of learning to navigate an industry she'd never imagined entering. Daily production figures, market price fluctuations, equipment maintenance schedules, the technical language that had once seemed incomprehensible now felt like a second language she was becoming fluent in through necessity and determination.
"Production is up 3% from last week," David reported. "The new extraction equipment on Formation C is performing even better than the manufacturer projected. At this rate, we'll exceed our quarterly targets by 15%. Sarah nodded, scanning the figures that represented not just barrels of oil, but the continued vindication of Uncle Joaquín's lifelong belief. Every successful day of production was another confirmation that he had been right to spend 50 years believing in something others couldn't see. "Any word from the legal team about the Holloway situation?" Sarah asked. David's expression darkened slightly. The federal investigation is moving forward. Apparently, Janet Holloway's operation was much larger than anyone initially realized. They've been conducting fraudulent land acquisitions across 3 states, always targeting properties with suspected mineral rights. The revelation of Janet Holloway's criminal enterprise had been one of the most satisfying aspects of Sarah's transformation from victim to victor. The FBI's investigation had uncovered a sophisticated scheme involving forged geological reports, bribed local officials, and intimidation tactics that had defrauded dozens of property owners out of potentially valuable mineral rights. Janet and Robert Caldwell were facing federal charges that would likely result in decades in prison. "What about the other families they defrauded?" Sarah asked. "Your legal team is coordinating with the prosecution to identify other victims. There's talk of establishing a fund to help families who lost property to Holloway's scheme." Sarah smiled, thinking about the conversation she had with her lawyer the previous week about using a portion of her oil revenues to help other families who hadn't been as fortunate as she had been. Uncle Joaquín's vindication felt incomplete without sharing the benefits of his discovery with others who had been targeted by the same predators. The sound of children's laughter drifted across the observation deck, and Sarah turned to see Miguel and Sofia emerging from the newly constructed education center that had become one of her favorite additions to the property. The building served multiple purposes: a place where visiting school groups could learn about geology and petroleum extraction, a research facility where graduate students could study the unique formations Uncle Joaquín had discovered, and most importantly, a living memorial to a man who never stopped believing in the power of education and persistence. "Mom, you should see the new interactive display about seismic testing," Miguel called out, his enthusiasm bright and uncontained. At 11, he had developed a genuine fascination with the geological processes that had created their family's good fortune. His teachers had suggested he might have a future in engineering or earth sciences, ideas that no longer seemed limited by financial constraints. Sophia, now 9 and still possessed of the uncompromising optimism that helped guide Sarah through her darkest moments of doubt, ran ahead with the boundless energy that came from knowing the world was full of possibilities. "The geologist said she's never seen rock formations as interesting as ours. She said Uncle Joaquín was like a detective who solved a mystery that took millions of years to create." Sarah felt the familiar surge of emotion that came whenever her children spoke about Uncle Joaquín with the reverence he had always deserved but rarely received while he was alive. The education center contained a small museum dedicated to his life and work, displaying his geological maps, correspondence with various experts, and photographs spanning 5 decades of unwavering belief. Visitors often commented on the meticulous documentation of his research, the careful scientific approach he had taken to what others dismissed as wishful thinking. Speaking of Uncle Joaquín, Elena's bringing Grandma Rosa out this afternoon for the dedication ceremony. The ceremony was something Sarah had been planning for months, the formal dedication of the Joaquín Martinez Memorial Research Foundation, a nonprofit organization funded by oil revenues and dedicated to supporting independent geological research and education. The foundation would award grants to students studying earth sciences, fund research into sustainable extraction techniques, and most importantly, ensure that Uncle Joaquín's story became a permanent part of the scientific record.
Elena had been Sarah's closest advisor throughout the transition from poverty to wealth, helping her navigate not just the financial complexity of sudden riches, but the emotional challenge of maintaining perspective and family connections when everything else in life had changed. Elena's practical wisdom had proved invaluable in keeping Sarah grounded during months when the magnitude of her good fortune threatened to overwhelm her sense of reality. "Are you nervous about the speech?" Miguel asked with the intuitive concern that had made him such a reliable barometer of his mother's emotional state throughout their journey. Sarah considered the question seriously. In a few hours, she would address an audience that included state officials, oil industry executives, geological researchers, and family members, formally launching a foundation that would ensure Uncle Joaquín's legacy extended far beyond the wealth his discovery had generated. It was a responsibility that felt both humbling and inspiring. "A little nervous," she admitted, "but mostly excited.
This feels like the culmination of something Uncle Joaquín started, not just the beginning of something new. The morning passed quickly as Sarah reviewed the final preparations for the ceremony. The event would be held outdoors, with the oil field serving as a backdrop that illustrated the practical results of Uncle Joaquín's theoretical beliefs. Christine Matthews would speak about the geological significance of the discovery. A representative from the State University would discuss the educational opportunities the foundation would support. And Sarah would close the ceremony with remarks about the importance of believing in dreams that others couldn't see. By early afternoon, cars and trucks were arriving along the newly paved roads that had replaced the gravel paths Sarah remembered from her first visit to the property. The guests represented a cross-section of Sarah's old and new worlds: former colleagues from the insurance office, neighbors from her apartment complex, geological researchers from universities across the region, and oil industry professionals who had become part of her extended professional family. Elena arrived with their grandmother, Rosa Martinez, a woman in her 80s who had been Uncle Joaquín's closest family member during his lifetime. Rosa walked with careful steps but keen eyes, studying the transformation of her brother's property with a mixture of amazement and vindication. Joaquín always said this land was special, Rosa told Sarah as they toured the facility. When we were children, he used to collect rocks and tell stories about what was hidden beneath our feet. Our parents thought it was just childhood imagination, but Joaquín never stopped believing. The ceremony began at 3 o'clock, with guests seated on folding chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the oil field. Christine spoke first, delivering a technical but accessible explanation of the geological formations that made the Martinez property so unique. She described Uncle Joaquín's research with professional respect, noting that his amateur geological work had identified formations that professional surveys had missed. Joaquín Martinez was what we call a citizen scientist, she explained to the audience. He lacked formal training, but he possessed something more valuable: the patience to observe, the dedication to document, and the courage to believe in evidence that contradicted conventional wisdom. His work is now being studied by geological researchers around the world as an example of how persistent amateur investigation can contribute to our understanding of petroleum geology. The university representative spoke about the educational programs the foundation would support, describing scholarship opportunities for students from backgrounds similar to Sarah's, families where higher education seemed like an impossible dream rather than an attainable goal. The foundation would specifically seek out students whose academic potential exceeded their financial resources, ensuring that Uncle Joaquín's legacy included opening doors for others who might otherwise never have the chance to pursue their dreams. When Sarah's turn came to speak, she stood before the audience with Miguel and Sofia flanking her, feeling the weight of the moment and the responsibility it represented. The prepared remarks she had practiced seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what she wanted to convey, so she set aside her notes and spoke from the heart. 8 months ago, I was a divorced single mother working part-time at an insurance office, struggling to pay rent on a 2-bedroom apartment and worried about my children's future. I had never heard of seismic testing, didn't know the difference between crude oil and petroleum, and thought geological surveys were something that happened to other people in other places.
She gestured toward the oil field, where the rhythmic pumping of extraction equipment provided a mechanical heartbeat for her words. Today, I'm standing on land that produces enough oil to fund my children's education, support geological research, and help other families who have been targeted by people who tried to steal their dreams. Sarah looked at Rosa, whose eyes were bright with tears of pride and loss. But this transformation didn't begin 8 months ago. It began 50 years ago, when a man named Joaquín Martinez looked at empty scrubland and saw possibility. It began when he decided that other people's doubts weren't more important than his own observations. It began when he chose to believe in something he couldn't prove, even when that belief cost him the respect of his neighbors and the understanding of his family. The audience was completely quiet.
the only sounds the distant hum of oil equipment and the wind moving through the mesquite trees that still dotted the landscape. Uncle Joaquín died before he could see his beliefs vindicated, but he left something more valuable than oil in the ground. He left an example of what happens when someone refuses to give up on a dream, even when that dream seems impossible to everyone else. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks but continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. The Joaquín Martinez Memorial Research Foundation isn't just about funding geological research or supporting education. It's about preserving the memory of what one person can accomplish when they have the courage to believe in something others can't see. She looked at Miguel and Sofia, these two children who had witnessed their family's transformation from scarcity to abundance, from fear to possibility. My children have learned that dreams aren't just wishes, they're hypotheses waiting to be tested. They've learned that other people's limitations don't have to become their limitations. They've learned that sometimes the most important discoveries are made by people who refuse to accept that something is impossible. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a bronze plaque that would be permanently mounted at the entrance to the education center. The inscription read, Joaquín Martinez, 1935 to 2024, geologist, dreamer, believer in hidden possibilities. The earth keeps its secrets from those who stop listening, but reveals its treasures to those who never stop believing. As guests moved to the reception area for refreshments and conversation, Sarah found herself standing beside the memorial plaque with Rosa, both women studying the words that attempted to capture the essence of a man whose legacy had exceeded anything he could have imagined. He would have loved this, Rosa said quietly. Not the money, not the recognition, but the idea that his work might help other people believe in their own dreams. Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what her grandmother meant. The wealth Uncle Joaquín's discovery had generated was life-changing, but it wasn't the most important part of his legacy. The most important part was the example he had set, that knowledge and persistence could overcome doubt, that individual belief could triumph over collective skepticism, and that some dreams were worth pursuing even when they took a lifetime to achieve. That evening, after the guests had departed and the oil field had settled into its nighttime rhythm, Sarah sat on the farmhouse porch with Miguel and Sofia, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The house itself had been completely renovated, transformed from a deteriorating structure into a comfortable home that served as both family residence and headquarters for the foundation's operations. "What do you think Uncle Joaquín would say if he could see all this?" Sofia asked, her voice carrying the philosophical curiosity that seemed to deepen with each passing month. Sarah considered the question seriously. Uncle Joaquín had spent his final years believing that his life's work would ultimately be vindicated, but he could never have imagined the scope of what that vindication would include. The oil production that exceeded all projections, the foundation that would support geological research for generations, the educational opportunities that would help other families escape the limitations of poverty. All of it had grown from seeds he had planted without knowing what they might become. "I think he would say that the discovery was never really about the oil," Sarah said finally. "I think he would say it was about proving that the impossible becomes possible when someone refuses to stop believing in it."
Miguel, always practical, was studying the lights of the oil field with the analytical intensity he brought to complex problems. "Do you think we'll keep believing in impossible things now that we know this one was true?" It was a profound question from an 11-year-old, and Sarah realized that her answer would help shape how her children understood not just their good fortune, but their responsibility to use it wisely. "I think Uncle Joaquín's greatest gift to us wasn't the oil under this land," she said. "His greatest gift was teaching us that believing in something bigger than what other people can see is worth the risk of being wrong." She pulled both children close, feeling the evening wind carry the scent of possibility,
across land that had hidden its secrets for millions of years before finally revealing them to a man patient enough to listen. And I think that means we have an obligation to help other people believe in their own impossible dreams, even when we can't see how those dreams might come true. As the Texas night settled around them, Sarah Martinez sat with her children on the porch of a house that had been rebuilt on the foundation of one man's unwavering faith in hidden possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new responsibilities that came with wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet evidence of dreams made manifest, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding that some victories are worth waiting 50 years to achieve, and some beliefs are worth maintaining even when the world insists they're impossible. Uncle Joaquín's legacy lived on, not just in the oil that flowed from his land, but in the example he had set for anyone brave enough to believe in something others couldn't see. And in that legacy, Sarah had found not just financial security, but a foundation upon which to build a life that honored both the dreams of the past and the possibilities of the future. 5 years later, Dr. Miguel Martinez stood at the podium in the main auditorium of the Joaquín Martinez Institute for Earth Sciences, looking out at an audience of geology students, research fellows, and visiting professors who had gathered for the annual memorial lecture. At 16, Miguel possessed the same analytical intensity he had shown as a child, but it was now focused through the lens of advanced geological studies and a deep understanding of the science that had validated his great-great-uncle's lifelong beliefs. 5 years ago, Miguel began, his voice carrying the confidence that came from growing up in an environment where questions were encouraged and curiosity was rewarded. My mother, sister, and I stood on empty scrubland that everyone said was worthless. Today, that land has produced over 40 million barrels of oil, funded the education of 300 students, and supported geological research on 4 continents. The audience listened with the respectful attention that Miguel had learned to expect when speaking about Uncle Joaquín's legacy. The Institute had become internationally recognized for its research into petroleum geology and sustainable extraction techniques, attracting students and researchers from around the world who wanted to study the formations that had made one man's impossible dream into scientific reality. Sarah sat in the front row, watching her son with the mixture of pride and amazement that had become her constant companion over the past 5 years. Miguel's transformation from curious 10-year-old to serious young scientist had been gradual but profound, shaped by growing up surrounded by geological equipment, research projects, and the constant reminder that knowledge and persistence could overcome any obstacle. Beside her, Sophia, now 14, and showing signs of inheriting her brother's intellectual intensity, was taking notes for a school project about family history. Sophia had developed her own fascination with the business side of oil production, often joining Sarah for meetings with operations managers and financial advisors, asking questions that revealed a natural aptitude for understanding complex economic relationships.
But the most important thing Uncle Joaquín left us, Miguel continued, wasn't the oil or the money, or even the scientific recognition. The most important thing he left us was proof that believing in something others can't see isn't foolishness. It's the foundation of all discovery. The Institute itself had grown far beyond Sarah's original vision. What had begun as a simple education center had evolved into a full research facility with dormitories, laboratories, and field study programs that attracted some of the brightest minds in geological sciences. The Martinez Foundation funded not just individual scholarships, but entire research programs focused on developing more efficient and environmentally responsible methods of resource extraction. Christine Matthews, now in her late 50s and serving as the Institute's Director of Geological Research, had often remarked that Uncle Joaquín's discovery had contributed as much to the advancement of petroleum geology as any professional research program. The unique formations beneath the Martinez property had yielded insights into oil formation and migration that were being applied to exploration projects around the world. After Miguel's presentation, the audience moved to the reception area, where conversations naturally centered around current research projects and ongoing exploration programs. Sarah found herself in a discussion with Dr. Rebecca Torres, a young geologist who had received one of the Foundation's first research grants and was now leading a team studying similar formations in South America. The techniques we developed here are revolutionizing exploration in regions that were previously considered non-viable, Dr. Torres explained. We're finding oil reserves in places that traditional geological models said were impossible, simply because we're using assessment methods that Uncle Joaquín pioneered through his amateur research. It was gratifying to know that Uncle Joaquín's work was continuing to yield discoveries in places he had never seen, proving that his approach to geological investigation had applications far beyond his own property. The Foundation had funded research projects on every continent, all building on principles that Uncle Joaquín had developed through decades of careful observation and meticulous documentation. Later that evening, Sarah stood on the observation deck that had become her favorite place for reflection, watching the lights of the oil field stretch toward the horizon. The production had stabilized at levels that exceeded even the most optimistic projections, generating enough revenue to fund the Foundation's operations while maintaining substantial reserves for future expansion and family security. Miguel and Sophia joined her as they often did for these quiet moments of family connection. The children had grown up wealthy, but Sarah had worked carefully to ensure their privilege came with understanding and responsibility. Both children spent their summers working in various capacities at the oil field and institute, learning firsthand about the operations that supported their family's good fortune. "I've been thinking about Uncle Joaquín a lot today," Sophia said, settling into her favorite spot on the deck railing. "Do you think he ever imagined that his work would lead to all this?" Sarah considered the question, looking out over a landscape that bore little resemblance to the empty scrubland she had inherited 5 years earlier. The oil field was now a model of efficient, environmentally responsible production. The Institute was training the next generation of geological researchers, and the Foundation was supporting discoveries around the world. Miguel was studying the technical readouts on his tablet, a habit he had developed of monitoring production data and research progress. The Institute's latest survey results came in today. They've identified 3 more potential drilling sites that show the same geological markers Uncle Joaquín originally found. The expansion of production to additional sites on the property had been a careful, gradual process, guided by the same principles of thorough research and scientific rigor that Uncle Joaquín had demonstrated. Each new discovery reinforced the validity of his original observations while contributing to the growing body of knowledge about the unique geological formations he had spent his life studying. "What's most amazing to me," Sophia added, "is how many people told him he was wrong, and he just kept believing anyway, even when everyone else said it was impossible." Sarah smiled, remembering her own moments of doubt during those first terrifying weeks when she had been forced to choose between safety and possibility. "Uncle Joaquín understood something that took me a long time to learn. Other people's limitations don't have to become your limitations." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Elena, who had driven out from town for Miguel's presentation. Elena's role in the family had evolved into something like chief family advisor, helping Sarah navigate the complex decisions that came with managing substantial wealth while maintaining perspective and family connections. "Wonderful presentation today," Elena told Miguel, settling into a chair beside them. "Uncle Joaquín would have been so proud to see you explaining his work to university professors." Elena had been Sarah's anchor throughout the transformation,
providing practical wisdom and emotional support during the overwhelming early months when everything in their lives had changed simultaneously. Her presence at family gatherings and foundation events served as a constant reminder of who they had been before wealth complicated their relationships with the world. "I've been thinking about something," Miguel said, his tone carrying the seriousness he brought to important announcements. "I want to dedicate my senior thesis to Uncle Joaquín's geological methods. I want to document exactly how he identified the formations that everyone else missed." Sarah felt a familiar surge of emotion at her son's determination to honor Uncle Joaquín's memory through academic work. Miguel's thesis would be the first formal scholarly analysis of Uncle Joaquín's amateur geological research, potentially cementing his place in the official scientific record. "That's a beautiful idea," Sarah said, "but it's also going to be a lot of work. Uncle Joaquín's documentation spans 50 years. "I know," Miguel replied, with the quiet confidence he had inherited from both his mother and his great-great-uncle. "But some things are worth doing, even when they're difficult." As the evening progressed, and the conversation moved from geological research to family memories to plans for future foundation projects, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that came from understanding that Uncle Joaquín's legacy had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined. His belief in hidden possibilities had created not just wealth, but an institution dedicated to supporting others who dared to believe in dreams that seemed impossible. The oil field would continue producing for decades. The institute would train generations of geological researchers, and the foundation would support discoveries that might change the world in ways none of them could currently envision. But the most important part of Uncle Joaquín's legacy would always be the example he had set, that believing in something others couldn't see wasn't madness, but the foundation of all human progress. Later that night, after Elena had returned to town and the children had gone to their rooms, Sarah sat alone on the observation deck looking out over the lights of an operation that transformed Uncle Joaquín's impossible dream into daily reality. In her lap was a leather-bound journal where she had been documenting the family's journey, creating a record that future generations could consult when they faced their own moments of doubt and possibility. She opened to a fresh page and began to write. 5 years ago, I thought inheritance meant receiving something that belonged to the past. Today, I understand that inheritance means receiving responsibility for the future. Uncle Joaquín didn't just leave us oil in the ground. He left us proof that the impossible becomes possible when someone refuses to stop believing in it. Tomorrow, Miguel will begin his senior thesis documenting Uncle Joaquín's geological methods. Sophia will start her summer internship in the Foundation's business operations. The Institute will welcome 30 new research fellows from around the world. The oil field will produce another day's worth of resources that fund education, research, and discovery. But tonight, I'm thinking about a man who spent 50 years believing in something he couldn't prove, documenting evidence that others dismissed, and maintaining faith in possibilities that seemed too large for one person to hope for. Uncle Joaquín Martinez died believing that his land held secrets worth discovering. He was right about the oil, but he was right about something more important. He was right that believing in hidden possibilities is never foolish, even when it takes a lifetime to prove. Especially when it takes a lifetime to prove. Sarah closed the journal and looked out over the landscape that had been transformed by one man's unwavering faith in evidence that others couldn't see. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and new opportunities to honor Uncle Joaquín's legacy by supporting others who dared to believe in impossible dreams. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet evidence of dreams made manifest, Sarah Martinez felt the deep peace that comes from understanding that some victories are worth waiting 50 years to achieve, and some beliefs are vindicated not just by their eventual success, but by the courage required to maintain them when success seems impossible. Uncle Joaquín's story had become their story. His dreams had become their reality, and his example had become their responsibility. In the end, that was the most valuable inheritance of all. The knowledge that believing in something others couldn't see wasn't just possible. It was the foundation upon which all meaningful change was built. The oil would eventually run out, the money would be spent on worthy causes, and the institute would evolve to meet challenges not yet imagined. But the example Uncle Joaquín had set, that individual belief could triumph over collective skepticism, that knowledge and persistence could overcome any obstacle, and that hidden possibilities were always worth pursuing, would endure as long as there were people brave enough to believe in dreams that seemed too large for reality to contain. And in that endurance, Uncle Joaquín would finally receive the recognition he had always deserved, not as the eccentric old man who got lucky, but as the visionary who understood that the earth reveals its treasures only to those who never stop believing they exist. Sarah Martinez stood at the entrance of the Joaquín Martinez Memorial Institute for Earth Sciences, watching her 16-year-old son Miguel address an audience of geology students and research fellows who had gathered for the annual memorial lecture. The transformation of her family's life seemed almost surreal when she remembered the struggling single mother who had inherited worthless farmland just 5 years earlier. Uncle Joaquín spent 50 years believing in something everyone said was impossible. Today, this land has produced over 40 million barrels of oil, funded the education of hundreds of students, and supported geological research on 4 continents. The numbers still amazed Sarah. 40 million barrels extracted, with reserves indicating decades more production ahead. The Martinez Foundation had awarded over 300 scholarships, funded research projects around the world, and established the Institute as a leading center for petroleum geology education. Uncle Joaquín's impossible dream had become an empire built on the foundation of never giving up. Sophia, now 14, and possessing her brother's intellectual intensity, was documenting the lecture for her own school project about family legacy. Both children had grown up understanding that their wealth came with responsibility, to honor Uncle Joaquín's memory, to support others who dared to believe in impossible dreams, and to never forget the lesson that believing in hidden possibilities was the foundation of all discovery. The oil would eventually run out, the money would be spent on worthy causes, and the Institute would evolve to meet challenges not yet imagined. But the example Uncle Joaquín had set, that individual belief could triumph over collective skepticism, that knowledge and persistence could overcome any obstacle, and that hidden possibilities were always worth pursuing, would endure as long as there were people brave enough to believe in dreams that seemed too large for reality to contain.
That evening, the family gathered on the observation deck overlooking the oil field, a tradition that had developed over the years as their way of maintaining connection to Uncle Joaquín's memory. The lights of the operation stretched toward the horizon, a mechanical constellation that represented the transformation of dreams into reality. "I've decided what I want to do for my senior thesis," Miguel announced,
his tone carrying the seriousness he brought to important decisions. "I want to document Uncle Joaquín's geological methods and prove how his amateur research contributed to professional petroleum geology." Sarah felt the familiar surge of emotion that came whenever her children demonstrated their commitment to honoring their great-great-uncle's legacy. Miguel's thesis would be the first formal academic analysis of Uncle Joaquín's work, potentially securing his place in the official scientific record. "What's most amazing to me," Sophia added, "is how he never stopped believing, even when everyone told him he was wrong, even when his own family thought he was wasting his life chasing impossible dreams." Elena, who had driven out from town to attend Miguel's presentation, smiled at her niece's observation. "That's exactly what Uncle Joaquín would want you to remember. Not the money or the recognition, but the importance of believing in something bigger than what other people can see." The conversation turned to future plans for the foundation and institute. Miguel would be starting his advanced geological studies in the fall, with the goal of developing even more innovative exploration techniques. Sophia was showing interest in the business side of operations, asking sophisticated questions about resource management and sustainable extraction practices. As the evening settled around them, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been a struggling single mother, facing the choice between accepting $15,000 for worthless land or believing in the dreams of a great uncle she barely knew. The decision to trust Uncle Joaquín's vision required courage she didn't know she possessed. "You know what I think Uncle Joaquín would say if he could see all this?" Sarah said, gesturing toward the lights of the oil field and the research institute that bore his name. "What?" Sophia asked, settling closer to her mother in the gathering darkness. "I think he would say that the discovery was never really about the oil. I think he would say it was about proving that the impossible becomes possible when someone refuses to stop believing in it." Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "And I think he would say that now it's our responsibility to help other people believe in their own impossible dreams." The wisdom in his son's words struck Sarah with force. Uncle Joaquín's legacy wasn't just the wealth he had left them, but the example he had set about the power of unwavering belief. The foundation, the institute, the scholarships and research programs, all of it was built on the principle that supporting others who dared to believe in hidden possibilities was the most meaningful way to honor his memory. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed and Elena had returned to town, Sarah sat alone on the observation deck, documenting the day's events in the leather-bound journal where she recorded their family's continuing story. She wanted future generations to understand not just what Uncle Joaquín had discovered, but why his example remained relevant long after the oil wells had made them wealthy. Uncle Joaquín Martinez died believing that his land held secrets worth discovering. He was right about the oil, but he was right about something more important. He was right that believing in hidden possibilities is never foolish, even when it takes a lifetime to prove, especially when it takes a lifetime to prove.
The oil field hummed quietly in the darkness, a mechanical heartbeat that would continue for decades, generating resources that would fund education, research, and discovery long after Sarah's children had children of their own. But the most valuable part of Uncle Joaquín's inheritance wasn't the petroleum beneath the ground. It was the knowledge that some dreams were worth pursuing even when they seemed impossible, and some beliefs were vindicated not just by their eventual success, but by the courage required to maintain them when success seemed like a fantasy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to honor Uncle Joaquín's legacy by supporting others who dared to believe in impossible dreams. But tonight,
Surrounded by the quiet evidence of dreams made manifest, Sarah Martinez felt the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding that the greatest discoveries aren't found in the ground. They're found in the human capacity to believe in possibilities that others can't see. Uncle Joaquín's story had become their story. His dreams had become their reality, and his example had become their responsibility. In the end, that was the most valuable inheritance of all. What an incredible journey from that first day in the courthouse to building a multi-million-dollar oil empire. If this story inspired you to believe in your own impossible dreams, please hit that like button and share it with others who need this message. Subscribe for more amazing true stories about ordinary people who achieved extraordinary things through persistence and faith. Remember, your dreams might be closer to reality than you think.